Good morning everyone, and welcome to Indigenous History and Identity Week 10, subject Indigenous Research Methodologies. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land that we... Today we will be looking at what does it mean by knowledge, what is research, and touch on some similarities between other colonised people in other areas, and look at anthropological gaze and how anthropologists have understood and framed Indigenous people. We will then look at what it means by Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous research methodologies and a few prominent Indigenous researchers. Before we move on, there are some concepts which need to be defined. Some you may reference these more in your university journey and later in the lecture in relation to Indigenous research. Ontology, epistemology, axiology. These are assumptions about the nature of reality, knowledge and values. Ontology, what is real? Broadly, the study of existence, encompassing everything that exists, as well as the nature of existence itself. How do we define real? Epistemology, what is knowledge? What does it mean to know? Ontology is concerned with the study of existence, encompassing everything that exists, as well as the nature of existence itself. A fundamental view of the world around us. Things aren't always the way they appear. The perceptual process is not perfect. We all know, or think we know, but there are times when our senses lead us to make incorrect judgments. Remember the cup analogy from our previous tutorial. And we have all seen these types of optical illusions. Epistemology, what is knowledge? What does it mean to know? And we'll unpack that further too. So, knowing how. Like many words, the word know is used in many different ways, like knowing how. How do you know how to ride a horse or to swim? This means generally, do you now have the ability to do that? If you don't, then how do you know how? Another way to look at this knowledge is knowledge by acquaintance, or seeing it for yourself. For instance, do you know Uluru? Generally that means you have seen it or been there. You may know nothing at all except that you saw it. A person who has never been there but read all about it in a book or an encyclopedia or on Google search may know more facts about that than the person who has seen it. And I think knowledge by acquaintance is something that has impacted on outsider understanding of Aboriginal people. Many philosophers argue that this isn't knowledge at all. It is only acquaintance. For instance, seeing some colours in your field of vision isn't knowledge, but forming concepts from your sensations and recognising that it's an animal in the bush is knowledge. You can't have knowledge of the world without acquaintance, but acquaintance alone is not yet knowledge. The sense of knowing that interests philosophers the most, and where there is much controversy and confusion, is the knowing that. Did you know that there's a supernatural entity controlling the world? How do you know that there is a God? How do you know that you are reading a book or listening to me right now, if you are? Or that there are no unicorns in the world? These are some deep and interesting questions. What are the requirements for knowing something as opposed to just believing it or wondering about it? Axiology, what is of value and or good? So it refers to the analysis of values to better understand their meanings, characteristics, their origins, their purpose, their influence on people's daily experiences. This is often seen as part of a moral philosophy and deals with the nature of ethics, aesthetics, and spirituality and their role in the construction of knowledge. In the Indigenous research context, this is often expressed as a set of. So I'll just give you a brief definition of methods and methodology. Methods are the techniques or procedures used to collect and analyse data. So if we're looking at non-Indigenous research, we might look at interviews and surveys, and some Indigenous methods are storytelling and yarning circles. Methodology is discussions of how research is done and the critical evaluation of alternative research strategies and methods. It also deals with logic. Social research is about answering research questions. Usually, there are 4 types of research questions that can be asked: what, why, when, and how. All research questions can be reduced to these 4 types of questions. Social research will also address one or more of the following objectives: exploration, description, understanding, explanation, prediction, intervention or change, evaluation, and impact assessment. And of course, these research strategies and approaches are shaped by the researcher's philosophical principles and worldviews. We know that social research is inherently a political activity, and it may involve conflicting interests from the researcher, the funders and policymakers, and the people whose lives and views are being explored, or sometimes, more importantly, explored. Some of the questions we need to ask ourselves when we look at research are: whose interests are being served by the research? For whom is it undertaken? What benefits will there be, and who gains from those benefits? Who has control over the distribution of the research findings, and how can those researched find a voice in the research process? These issues are contested. I want to touch briefly on why Indigenous researchers and methodologies are vital. Historically, Indigenous people have been researched through the anthropological gaze. Briefly, it is about knowing the native. Anthropological and colonial discourse about understanding the mentality of Indigenous people, the abilities and capabilities of natives to think and act like white people. Much observing and recording has been done by anthropologists, and in some instances these recordings have enabled many marginalised Indigenous people within Australia to reconnect with their ancestors, and especially with learning of language now, with the resources that have been collected by anthropologists in the past. However, on the whole, much of the anthropological studies of the past ensured the reproduction of the hegemonic processes of colonial settlement. Professor Linda Tuiwa-Smith, an academic from New Zealand, wrote, "Of all the disciplines, anthropology is the one most closely associated with the study of the other and with defining of primitivism. The ethnographic gaze of anthropology has collected, classified, and represented other cultures to the extent that anthropologists are often the academics popularly perceived by the Indigenous world as the epitome of all that is bad with academic." Historically, anthropological and colonial discourse was about understanding the mentality of Indigenous people, their abilities and capabilities to think and act like white people, as I mentioned before. Research done on Indigenous people and communities was dominated by amateur ethnographers and historians. Examples of this are such as Daisy Bates in South Australia. Earliest writings and drawings of European explorers and observers were often impaired by linguistic and philosophical differences. there was a tendency to reconstruct Indigenous social, economic and political practices to conform with Eurocentric standards. Anthropologists were obsessed with what was considered the traditional form of Aboriginal life, and for some this still is the case. Australian anthropology was concerned with pre-colonial social order to the point of blindness to the contemporary scene. This dichotomy between traditional and non-traditional Aboriginal people weaves its way through relevant anthropological discourse and remains deeply embedded in Physical anthropologists took observations and recorded them and were equipped with calipers to measure brain size, a von Luschen chromatic scale for classifying skin colour, and a camera for front and side headshots. This was done to help science complete the knowledge of what is regarded as the only prehistoric race left on the face of the earth, the Australian Aborigines. They were primarily interested in describing and analysing peoples with minimum European contact, focusing on what was seen as primitive cultures, and especially on the pristine, and a focus on the other. And you can see in this image, down in the bottom left-hand side, there is an Aboriginal woman from Tasmania, and this is the order of evolution. So she is right down at the bottom of the scale. Anthropologists propagated a discourse of blood quantum, race and culture, mixed blood, half-blood, mixed race, half-caste, part Aborigine, quadroon, and you can see the image of the von Luschen chromatic scale for skin colour. Anthropologists confirmed the validity of these concepts as an administrative strategy for regulating the lives of Aboriginal people, and these ideologies of race and racial purity further undermine the status of many Aboriginal people as real Aborigines, and we have seen this picture before in previous lectures. This leads to a main defining characteristic of Australian Aboriginal anthropology. It viewed Aboriginal people in the southeast and many urban settings as not authentic, as people who did not live as Aborigines, as people who had lost their Aboriginal culture and had only fragmented memory of their past culture. So you can see how Aboriginal people have been defined as a homogeneous people, how colour or lack of colour has been used to define Aboriginality and the cultural capacity, among other things. So let's move on to Indigenous knowledge. And it's good to look at where terms have originated. So let's have a look at science. Science comes from the Latin scientia and scire, which means to know. So this would indicate that science means a whole range of different knowledge systems. It didn't imply a specific method or a particular approach to understanding the world around us. The idea of science, as we know now, comes much later on. The word science comes with a whole range of new meanings as a range of professional philosophers and scientists began to form particular organisations. What we need to acknowledge is that Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge are internally heterogeneous categories. This means that what constitutes Western knowledge is not necessarily a homogeneous set of ontologies, epistemologies and axiologies. So if we looked at the categories of Western knowledge, what we will find is a range of conflicting views about the world and what constitutes research and research knowledge. By the same token, Indigenous knowledge has a range of different views as well. So it won't surprise you also that there are considerable debates about what can be known with Indigenous communities themselves. This is important because we tend to create these homogeneous categories. However, we need to acknowledge that there are disputes and contestations in both sides. So there are knowledge systems that Indigenous people talk about that exist, but some that are not mutually agreed upon. The last point I want to make is that both systems of knowledge have been in contact and exchanged for over 5 centuries around the world, and even much less in the Australian context. They do influence each other in certain ways. However, this has been unequal, as we know, and the relationship hasn't been one of equality at all. Indigenous knowledge and the knowledge produced by Indigenous people has not always been received with much attention and often disregarded. So now I'd like to talk about Indigenous research by Indigenous researchers and some of the challenges that occur in engaging in this type of research. We will look at some ongoing debates about power and control of the research process and the implications of different knowledge systems and their impact on research practice and understanding. I've chosen to look at the work of 2 Indigenous academics and their contributions. Dr. Karen Martin is a Ngunnawal woman from North Stradbroke Island, southeast Queensland. Her areas of expertise include Indigenous research, Aboriginal ontology, epistemology, axiology and methodology, Aboriginal research and critiquing the relationships to knowledge, research and researchers, Aboriginal knowledges and pedagogy, and reconceptualising Indigenous studies and the embedding of Indigenous perspectives. And the other researcher is Professor Martin Nakada, Torres Strait Island man and one of Australia's top Indigenous scholars, Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Education and Strategy at James Cook University in Townsville, and author of Disciplining the Savages and Savaging the Disciplines. This text provides alternative reading for those struggling with the contradictory and ambiguous intersections of academia with Indigenous experience. It moves beyond the usual criticisms of the disciplines which construct the way we have come to know and understand Indigenous peoples, and I thoroughly recommend that you have a look at Martin Nakada's work. Nakada's work focuses on the way Western scholarly research has positioned Indigenous people as subjects of other people's knowledge. As I said, Martin is a Torres Strait Islander man, so his work is around his people and experiences. He looks at how Torres Strait Island people were framed and positioned through the anthropological lens. In Savaging the Disciplines, Disciplining the Savages, Nakada discusses how the Cambridge expedition in 1904 and the Haddon reports positioned Torres Strait Islander people. Nakada argues that Indigenous people exist very much at the cultural interface, at the intersection of Indigenous and Western domains. He states at the interface, traditional forms and ways of knowing, or the residue of those, that we bring from the pre-contact historical trajectory, inform how we think and act. However, so do Western ways, and for many of us, it is a blend of both which has become our life world. It is within this space, with so many interwoven, conflicting discourses that distinguish traditional from non-traditional in the day-to-day, which can be difficult to sustain. What Nakada is saying is that we understand ourselves through both. According to Nakada, the cultural interface is also a complex and contested space, a space which shapes and conditions the lives of Indigenous people, a space within which Indigenous people are forced to operate, where Indigenous peoples make particular choices about what to accommodate, resist, and or reject. This suggests that although Indigenous people have to operate in this space, they still have agency. And Nakata also examines how we can reposition Indigenous people as knowing rather than simply the subjects of knowing. This is where Indigenous standpoint theory comes in. Nakata makes a distinction about Indigenous people being in a position of knowing rather than just being the subjects of knowing. Nakata makes the distinction between being in a position and developing a standpoint. Indigenous standpoint theory uses the experiences of Indigenous people as a first step in a critical analysis of accepting positions and arguments made by those in a more privileged social. So briefly, where does the idea of a standpoint theory originate? One of the most influential and controversial theories to emerge from feminist thinking is a feminist standpoint theory. Feminist standpoint theory emphasizes the relationship between power and knowledge production. When we look at Indigenous standpoint theory, we note it is not simply a reflection of an Indigenous experience, nor some hidden wisdom that Indigenous people possess simply awaiting discovery. Indigenous standpoint theory isn't an entirely new theory. However, it does draw on a history of other theoretical approaches. In 1989, Aileen Morton Robinson, an Aboriginal woman of the Goanpul tribe, part of the Quandamooka Nation on Stradbroke Island in Queensland, challenged a white female anthropologist about who could speak for whom. Aboriginal women began talking about their world from their perspective and not the perspective of the other. It is a complex issue which I encourage you to study further, and there is a... Let's take a look at Dr. Martin's work. And according to Martin, the myth of Terra Nullius implied that this country was uninhabited, and with Terra Nullius and social policy supported by research, it enabled for the dispossession of knowledges of Aboriginal people in all aspects of life, including at a tertiary level. Aboriginal people are, and in some social science disciplines, over-researched, and this has caused animosity, mistrust, and resistance from many Aboriginal people. Not so long ago, research conducted in Aboriginal lands was done without permission, consultation, or involvement of Aboriginal people. Martin calls this Terra Nullius research, or uninhabited research. Aboriginal people are present as objects of curiosity and subjects of research to be seen and not heard. The traditions of Western research have come under more scrutiny from Aboriginal academics, researchers and thinkers. A critique of Western research paradigms has resulted in Aboriginal writers and theorists reframing Western research experiences, and in doing so, developing their own research paradigms, programs, and ways of knowing. Martin discusses ontology as a Quandamooka ontology. She states that it is through ontology that we develop an awareness and sense of self. It is our reality. Martin is saying that she sees herself and her reality through a Quandamooka or Indigenous lens. This is where she positions her understanding of the world. She draws upon the knowledges, beliefs, experiences, and realities from her worldview. Within this view, Quandamooka is a land, waterways, skies, spiritual and law systems of the Quandamooka people, and your reading delves further into this understanding. Martin describes three main constructs and their processes. First, establishing through law what is known about things. Second, establishing the relationships amongst things. And thirdly, enacting ways for maintaining these relationships. It can be easier to look at it as ways of knowing, ways of being, and ways of doing. According to Porsanger, Indigenous methodologies all have a common philosophical base. Indigenous methodologies reflect our epistemologies, our ways of knowing, our axologies, our ways of doing, and our ontologies, ways of being. Indigenous methodologies make visible what is meaningful and logical in our understanding of ourselves and the world, and apply it to the research process. These ideas are further unpacked within the reading. For Indigenous research to be recognised by the Western research academia, it must also identify its methodology. Martin states that Western research is a Western practice, and as such is not a feature of our own world. So a research framework that is entirely Aboriginal is not possible. She states that Indigenous research occurs through centering Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing in alignment with aspects of Western qualitative research framework. When working with and in Indigenous communities and with Indigenous peoples, you need to think reflexively about the research process. This will involve interrogating common sense understandings of the world around us, reading against the grain of supposedly self-evident truths rather than just taking them for granted, and that means questioning what has been researched in the past and how it has been researched. And questioning what may appear to be obvious, common sense, or natural. Thank you very much for your time today, and I hope to see you all in the tutorials where we'll be unpacking Indigenous research methodologies further.